Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our audience in person and online. It is with great pleasure and honor that I welcome you to our second Alumni Café event of the year. My name is Mayna Rambali, and I'm the president of the Woodsworth College Alumni Association. I'm here this evening with my fellow directors, Yasmin, John, Owen, he's just outside, Michael, and Sophia online. First, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We commence by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huon-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and gather on this land. I will now pass it on to Yasmin for this evening's agenda. Yasmin?
Hi, everyone. I just have a few housekeeping points before we can get started. So this lecture is being recorded and will be posted to the Woodsworth College's YouTube channel. And for those joining online, the technical team has enabled the live captioning. You can view the captions by enabling the closed caption function through settings at the right bottom corner of your screen. A Q&A session will follow the lecture. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. At the conclusion of the lecture, we will send you a short survey. We would appreciate you taking a few minutes to complete it. After the lecture, we will take a brief recess before proceeding to the Art Museum for a guided tour of the art exhibition Outer World. Now for the fun stuff. As many of you know, the Alumni Café is our Alumni Association's flagship event, through which we strive to provide a platform for a stimulating discussion that features our speakers' research and expertise that resonates with the diverse backgrounds of our alumni. On the agenda tonight, we will hear a lecture from Professor Mikinaak Migwans titled Reclaiming Relations, Exploring the Deep History of Indigenous Materials Collected by Western Museums, the Movement of Repatriation and How Cultural Reclamation Nurtures Stronger Relationships. Professor Mikinaak Migwans is a member of the Wipwemkong Unceded Territory, an assistant professor in the Department of Art History, a curator of Indigenous art at the University of Toronto. Their research delves into the politics of placemaking, bridging the land and museum, with a special focus on textile arts in Anishinaabe territory. With experience spanning institutions such as the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the Study of Aboriginal Arts and Culture, the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation, and the National Gallery of Canada, Professor Migwans brings a wealth of knowledge and a deep commitment to Indigenous art and cultural reclamation. Their work explores the intersections of art, knowledge, and identity, offering unique insights into the role of cultural objects as teachers and tools for restoring relationships. Professor Migwans, we are very honored to have you among us and eager to hear the lecture tonight. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you everyone for being here and braving the snow, except those at home who are, your bravery is noted also. But I am pleased to be here tonight. I'm going to be speaking in a general manner on a topic that's very close to me, which is material culture as ancestral knowledge in museums. And I'm going to be focusing on some material that is from the Great Lakes and is specific to Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and other cultures from the Great Lakes. But at the same time, I'm trying to keep it general and kind of bring this as a kind of an overview of some of the history and some of the politics of Indigenous material culture in museums. I'd like, for this purpose, I'd like to introduce my assistant here. So this is, I'd like to speak along with a material object and help us understand what it is that constitutes an object in the eyes of the collector, what constitutes an object of knowledge, and what might be considered to be the larger self of the object that we're thinking about when we think about repatriation and reclamation, all right? This is a black ash splint basket made by a Mi'kmaq basket maker, probably fairly recently. probably around in the 80s or 90s. But a basket like this has been a source of intergenerational connection and survival for peoples across the Great Lakes and out into the East Coast for a long time now. It's carried us through a lot, and it carries a lot of knowledge and a lot of relationships within it. So this is a piece I brought in with the intention of sharing it with you in an interactive way. So I'm going to allow it to kind of go around through the lecture and allow you to experience it kind of in an embodied sensory way. All right, because I think that's an important part of what I'm trying to talk about here. There's also a little surprise helper on the inside, but I'm going to keep that one with me. It's a special one. All right. So please. Okay. So as our host mentioned, I'm Mikinaak Migwans, and I'm an assistant professor of art here in the art history department, and I'm also a curator of Indigenous art at the Art Museum. So I work between research, teaching, and curation. And I think a lot about objects, and I think a lot about how to teach with objects and how to restore relationships with objects. I want to start with a contemporary artwork, actually, because that's one of the key ways that I like to proceed in my pedagogy and in my research, is by starting with the work that Indigenous artists themselves are doing and connecting with those cultural items, and the kind of about the social and the political work that they're doing through those engagements with the materials. All right. I want to start with a contemporary artwork, actually, because that's one of the key ways that I like to proceed in my pedagogy and in my research, is by starting with the work that Indigenous artists themselves are doing and connecting with those cultural items, and the kind of about the social and the political work that they're doing through those engagements with the materials. All right. This is a work by the Mi'kmaq artist Ursula Johnson. So she's from the same area that this basket came from on the East Coast there. And it's called Museological Grand Hall in 2014. This is part of a three-piece series, and this is the first piece. In it, you can see that there is the ghostly shape of a black ash basket that is etched onto the glass of the vitrine, all right? She's made these vitrines to model the conventional kind of museum enclosure, the kind of container for the container that kind of makes the object, the museum object, right? It takes the cultural object and makes it into an object that is for and of the museum, right? And so by altering this with the image of the object, the image that is of the object that is missing from within it, she's doing a few things here that I find really interesting. I want to start from this piece and use it to center the question, what is the object of exchange, of collection, interpretation, and ultimately repatriation or reclamation? What is it that constitutes that object, and how did it become this object? How did it transform in that journey from its community of origin through different hands to the museum, perhaps, and then in kind of complex ways back again to its community? What is it that constitutes an object at all? There's a scholar, a museum studies scholar named Barbara Kirshenblatt Gimblett, and she terms the practice of ethnographic collecting, and I think this applies more generally to the collection of objects, as an act of excision, of selecting out an object from its complex network of surroundings, right? From the other objects around it, from the person that made it, from all the names that are applied to that artwork, and even to, the little things that you think of when you're snipping off a work to make it finished. If we extend the concept of those kind of things that are trimmed away to include things like the maker's name or the stories that we're told that go along with this, all the kind of the larger self of the object, that is the act of excision that tidies that kind of network of relations into an object, something that can fit into a vitrine, that can fit into an entry in a museum database, right? So if we're trying to look for the larger self of the object, we accept that this kind of object has been created in the act of collection in a certain sense, right? It has been remade and to fit into a certain kind of knowledge system. Is it the case that those things that were trimmed away, are they truly separated from that object, or is there a way of kind of reconstituting those relationships? Are those threads, those loose threads, still there? And we find different ways to use the object. That's one way of reclaiming it. Thank you. Um, um, are we able to return in some way to reconstitute those threads? This is the second work that's in that same series. The series is called Do You Remember? And this is the second part. So the first part were those vitrines with the black ash basket etched around it, right? This is the second part where she uses some of her grandmother's black ash basketry processing tools in order to try to familiarize herself with black ash as a material. This is a performance, so she puts herself kind of on display as an object almost, okay? So unlike the vitrine where there's a missing kind of basket in there, and we don't know why that basket is missing, we just see the ghostly impression of it. In this case, instead, she's herself offering herself as this object on display, right? In an art gallery context, but it's still, she's almost kind of making an object or a display of herself using tools that are related to her by blood, right? So these are her grandmother's tools. Her grandmother was one of those who, in those years throughout the 20th century, and it's been the case since we entered what's called the reservation era, right? When our land-based relations were forcibly severed, and we were moved on to certain settlements, and the kind of subsistence patterns were kind of intentionally reformed. Black ash basketry is one of those practices that has remained throughout that period and has carried many families through that difficult transition period, all right, into this kind of wage labor economy and into these different kind of systems, all right? And so all of the knowledge and all of the kind of relationships that formed around that practice of black ash basketry, those are still intact in a way, right? Not unchanged, but there is a continuous thread that goes down through all these basket making families, and it particularly centers around these usually women and usually older women in the family and their basketry practice, all right? So this art form that has carried many communities through these difficult years, all right, it now has come to represent something, not just represent, but to constitute something that is essential to our livelihoods and our sense of self in our communities, all right? So she's taking these items. This is a whole setup. We don't have a setup quite like this in where I'm from here in Anishinaabe territory. That's a hardcore setup, all right? What she's got there is she's got a whole setup for processing and actually shaving down the black ash tree itself. The black ash tree is and unique in the ability of its rings to come apart when you pound them with the back of an axe, all right? So there's not many trees where the growth rings will actually split apart and give you nice little splints. Not easily, but they will with some convincing. White ash can do that, but it's the black ash, which coincidentally is threatened now by ecological change and invasive species and climate change. But the black ash tree has been a partner of the Anishinaabe people, of Haudenosaunee people, of Mi'kmaq people for a long time. All right, so it is a material, not just a material and not just a kind of a resource that we can extract and use for commercial goals, but a partner in survival that has long been familiar. Over the course of colonization, though, the relationships intergenerationally are one of the key things that have been interrupted, and one of those kind of relationships is that has been felt between Ursula Johnson and her grandmother. Right, her grandmother did not pass down knowledge of how to make baskets to her grandchildren. She went to residential school. There are all these kind of colonial systems that are in place in order to specifically interrupt those ties that place people on the land. Those come into play. And so she has these tools, but she doesn't have the knowledge and she doesn't have the memories. So she's going and she's setting herself up with these tools and she's getting that black ash log there and she's getting ready to do it. And she starts working. She starts working and working and working and working. And that's the whole performance, is her working away on this log. It's a bit of an endurance performance piece. If any of you are familiar with performance art, sometimes those artists they make almost a show of their labor and their what they're undergoing as they're doing this. And as she's working away on this, by the end of the night, that black ash log is just splinters on the ground because she doesn't have the knowledge, she doesn't have the familiarity. She was never actually handed that from her grandmother, and so what she ends up with is just a pile of wood shavings on the ground. When I first learned about this work, I felt it felt very kind of devastating to me, right? It feels like the closure of possibility, or like somehow illustrating the successful kind of cutting of especially matrilineal relationships under colonialism. I think I've since come more to understand it, though, as part is that it's part of the process of learning, of course, to make a pile of sawdust, I guess. But she's learning, right? She's letting the materials learn for her, or to teach her, right? So she is taking those tools and she's taking some of those examples that she had and pieces like these, which are actually traced from a collection that includes her grandmother's actual objects and actual basketry, right? She took those baskets and she did learn from them. And there's a way we have to kind of invent and relearn ways to teach ourselves again, ways to constitute those relationships through objects, because they are objects and items that come about of material relations, and they do have the capacity to kind of make those reconnections again. So we're starting from these concepts, the idea of what it is that is the larger self of the object, and then what it is how it is that those objects have been shaped into this certain knowledge system in the museum, and then how it might be that we can reconstitute those relations or bring them back. So in order to do all of that in how much time we have left, I'm going to break it down a bit. We're going to break down into three kind of sections here, all right? We're going to start with modes of exchange, because I would like to speak a bit first about some of the ways that material culture moved between cultures and moved around areas between Indigenous peoples and between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, because it's true that our materials moved, okay? Items moved, people moved, and peoples changed. And some of these kind of, but amid all of that, there were key kind of relationships involved that were important to speak about. So after I talk about the modes of exchange, we'll go to speaking more about museums and some different modes of collection and display that kind of shape the ways that those objects came into museums and the forms that they took there as collections. And then finally, I'll go through some of the modes of reclamation that I think are important when we're approaching these materials today, because these are still all our belongings and museums. They're still there, and they're a resource to us now. In some ways, more rigorously offered than others, but it's important to be able to work with these materials today, from my view, and to allow them to be teachers again when it's been the case that they've been prevented from teaching us for so long. So let's begin by talking about maybe the first and most obvious way that materials have crossed cultural lines from both historically and in the present day is commerce. I'm interested, like my former supervisor and mentor, Ruth Phillips, who is a scholar of museum studies and of what you can call tourist art or souvenir arts. I'm interested in those things, those small things that kind of add up to a lot, right? All the kind of the things that are a little bit dismissed by art history to date as being perhaps too entangled with the market, too inauthentic, too kitschy, right? Those things are interesting, though, and those are actually the items that have kept many families alive for a long time, and they're beautiful. These items are beautiful and they're important, and they do have things to share with us. So we'll just start here with this idea of the commercial object as something that does have the capacity for relationships again, all right? So this one, I think, this one's a beautiful example of a black ash and sweetgrass basket that was made by an Akwesasne basket maker. This one's in a museum in Vienna currently. But there we have some beautiful pictures of it from the Grastek research organization there. All right, so from commerce, we also have a category of object that is about exchange or encapsulates treaty relations. I think that an important piece of context when we're talking about objects that have crossed cultural lines in the Great Lakes context is that that the exchange of objects has accompanied treaty making for a very long time prior to contact, okay? When you make treaty with another nation, or when you constitute a group of nations into a confederacy, as the case with this belt, this is a very important item that represents the Confederacy of Haudenosaunee, right? So this is actually, at the time, the 5 nations, today the 6 nations that were confederated into a single entity, into a single group. Although they remained independent as nations, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and then Tuscarora are represented on here, except the Tuscarora because they got there too late to make it onto the wampum belt, but they're there. The rafters were extended. But this is an item that that is outside what we would understand of the transactional relationship, right? So it's not an object that was issued to another party and money was given in exchange for it. But instead it encapsulates a relationship between groups of people. It's an object of collective ownership, and it's also an item that kind of encapsulates in very real ways the relationships among of many groups of people, all right? So diplomacy and treaty making is one of the key ways that objects have crossed boundaries. I'll also mention the concept of gifting in treaty making, all right? So there is an important category of object that is especially relevant in the Great Lakes that has crossed from indigenous hands into colonial collections as a gift given during treaty proceedings. And we'll talk a little bit about how those items, whether or not they still can perform or whether they're neutralized politically in the process of collection, right? Because when they're brought into collections and treated as relics or souvenirs or even art, when they're considered to be elevated to art, are they truly given the opportunity to perform that treaty relationship? And how can we make that the case again? Maybe that's not something that can happen from within the museum, or maybe it can. Who knows? But gifting. So on that topic as well, we have the item that might be considered to fall into the former category, but is actually more suitably put in the latter category, all right? So the gift that accompanies a treaty proceedings, all right? An item like this, so we might think of this is a quill work handbag made by Margaret Anderson from what is now Hiawatha First Nation, I believe, around 1860, okay? And this is one of the items that was crafted, one of the fine, beautiful items that was laboriously crafted by, in this context, Mississauga or Anishinaabe women, and to make a gift to the Prince of Wales when he visited Canada in 1860. At that time, Canada was still the crown. And so this visit by the Prince of Wales to what was then the colonies, more or less still, was a way for this indigenous group, which has been recently organized onto a reservation, to formally kind of present themselves on what to that point had been a nation-to-nation relationship with the crown. Part of when you show up and you have a treaty proceedings, or you wish to lodge a complaint, or you wish to kind of open up that forum again, is you have to show up with gifts. And so they did beautiful gifts. They showed up with these items. And at the time, these First Nations were being kind of unilaterally included into the settler state of Canada, right? So rather than a nation-to-nation relationship, which had previously been the case, they were folding them into what would shortly be called the Indian Act of Canada, right? And they were making them kind of wards of the state and kind of nations within and under the sovereignty of Canada, all right? So when the Prince of Wales and his retinue showed up and were given these gifts, I feel like there was almost, I'm not sure whether to call it a deliberate misunderstanding, but it was certainly strategic that these gifts were recognized as trinkets or trifles that were kind of being offered, as though they were representative of these kind of primitive peoples offering their little crafts to the visitors, right? when in fact these need to be contextualized in the longer history of diplomatic gift giving, right? In which precedes negotiations about your relationship and your status. So there's a whole body of these works that were given to the Prince of Wales at that time and are still in the in the royal trust there. They recently returned to Hiawatha First Nation, actually, and were kind of presented again in an interesting installation that I encourage you to check out there. Um, um, and that's one example, I think, of the ways that these items that were kind of that were museumified before, when we reinterpret them, we open that potential again to kind of reconsider the terms of that exchange, and that some of the politics that may have been neutralized or kind of cast aside along the way. So this is an example of some of the ways that these material culture items have crossed paths. I haven't mentioned things like confiscation or looting, which does become quite relevant later in time, and especially in the early 20th century. But I wanted to start with this because it's these. I wanted to point out some of the ways that even items that might conventionally be considered to be like crafts or commercial objects or souvenirs or things that were bought and sold, and that concludes the relationship. That's not the case, especially in this period of time, and that we need to consider the longer history of these items. All right. Next, we're going to talk about museums, all right? So we're going to talk about 3 modes of collection and display in particular, and I'll offer a kind of a more general historical overview of those, and then offer a bit of criticism about how those kinds of modes of collection and display have kind of contributed to this kind of colonial agenda of extraction on the part of these colonial institutions. All right, so the first mode of collection and display is the curiosity. I think we're familiar with the curiosity cabinet, right? I'll offer the definition given by Ruth Phillips and Janet Burlow, who said, "The curiosity is something that excited wonder and interest because of its craftsmanship, use of unfamiliar materials, or because its forms appeared strange or grotesque to Europeans." Okay, so in these curiosity cabinets, which were being made throughout the 17th to 19th century, both natural history items and indigenous materials were being kind of collected on the basis of the kind of the interest or the wonder, the curiosity that they invoked in others, right? And kept in cabinets that would represent the collector's kind of worldliness or their capacity for vision, or their or just something just that is for conversational purposes in a domestic setting. But as a curiosity, indigenous items are you can see are in the same kind of category, or in the same room, in the same arrangement as natural history items. And so they enter this kind of this configuration, which on the natural history specimens, we're going to lead to the Natural History Museum and indigenous materials along with it. The curiosity is also something that is kind of synonymous with the souvenir, right? The representation of a place of otherness or difference that you have visited to, some place that is beyond your own context and brought something back again, right? This is still, I think, an important kind of category today. So it's not just, I'm not trying to assert a kind of unilinear progression from Cabinet of Curiosity to ethnographic collecting to the art museum, but these are 3 categories that are kind of fill different roles, and I think are relevant to us today. So, for example, the curiosity is something that has been important in the Great Lakes region as tourist art materials that indigenous women, especially, would make and sell to support their families at tourist sites like Niagara Falls. So this is an image of a Tuscarora woman around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, selling at the time they were called whimsies. And they were these beaded items, and they developed this very unique style of beadwork, this raised beadwork especially, that became very emblematic of Tuscarora and Mohawk beadworkers, and is kind of still very significant to this day. Like the black ash basket, this beadwork became a kind of a social institution where knowledge passed down through the matrilineal line, right? As these women were making these items, even though they were for sale and were kind of disregarded as these kind of items that are kind of frivolous, that the practice of making them was an intact avenue for the intergenerational transfer of knowledge, and kind of remains significant to this day as a kind of a place where relationality and cultural value is still kind of is very strong. So the curiosity, okay, that's our first category. From the curiosity cabinet, and I guess you can cite some of the origins of the natural history collection in the curiosity cabinet in the way that specimens or items are arranged by their physical characteristics. In the 19th century, these arrangements became taxonomic, right? And a bit in doing so became a bit teleological, right? So the specimen was early anthropology adopted classificatory systems from natural history, under which cultural objects became specimens or evidence of the maker's place in an evolutionary schema. This was particularly the case of 19th century anthropology, and it was very influential, especially in this university, I guess. The Daniel Wilson, who was the first president of University College, for instance, was very much was a key scholar in the field that kind of used material things and what do you call it when they measure the skull? Phrenology, that whole science, right? To kind of assert hierarchies of human achievement, okay? So an example of this, I've used this. This is actually an illustration of Australian material culture, but I just find it a really well illustrated example of the kind of the logic that indigenous material culture was being kind of excised and placed into, right? So here you can see objects from across cultural contexts put into an arrangement that shows them as though they were evolving from the simpler to the more complex, right? It was considered a kind of commonplace idea in the 19th century that all cultures, like species, must evolve from less complex to more complex. And this is an idea that it's important, has been researched and kind of we've moved past, right? This idea that indigenous cultures especially are somehow the predecessor of what was called civilized Western society, right? We've moved on from that, but it is important also to understand how these items were collected and what it was that they were supposed to be representing when they were being collected, okay? So in this case, under the writings, this is Lewis Henry Morgan's particular formulation. He said that there were 3 stages of civilization: the savage, the barbarian, and the civilized, and that the form that a people's material culture took determined their place within that, all right? So, for example, if a culture predominantly made basketry, they were more likely to be savages. So, for instance, my people in the Anishinaabe, we're more seasonally mobile. The term then was nomadic. And so that placed us in savagery. The Haudenosaunee, though, they were very interested in the Haudenosaunee because they were considered closer to civilization because they made pottery. That is more, they said, that's more complex. That's a step up from basketry that makes them barbarians, but not civilized, right? And so on. So this was the kind of the system into which material cultures were being collected. And if we follow the logic of kind of the practice of excision, you kind of select out the pieces of material that are going to fit that schema, right? So you're using these materials to illustrate whatever theory it was. And at this point, it was cultural evolution. Okay. This is my title image for this. Is anyone familiar with this context here? This was a natural history museum. Is anyone familiar with where this is currently? This is a 19th century image. But if it's not familiar to you, you could, huh? It's not the Great Hall, but it is in this building. It's the University College. It's the library upstairs. Today it's a library. But it was the Natural History Museum at the time that I forget what it was called, but the University of Toronto when it was formed. And this was a key figure in this again was Daniel Wilson, who was the first principal of University College and was very involved in this kind of collecting of material of Indigenous material culture and Indigenous ancestral remains to kind of illustrate these evolutionary schema. And so a lot of the material that was collected and then kind of made into the basis of the collections at the Royal Ontario Museum, for instance, were specifically collected by Daniel Wilson and his collaborators to fit these ideas of cultural evolution that they were trying to assert themselves at the pinnacle of that scholarship at this period of time, right? So that is a bit of history of the Royal Ontario Museum as well, right? And a lot of the repatriations that have taken place at the Royal Ontario Museums have had to deal with this specific history. And I'll emphasize that this isn't an ongoing history. As anyone involved with repatriation has found, it's not simply a case of kind of finding the thing and then giving it back. We can talk about this a bit later, but it's a little bit more than that. But this is just to kind of place this pin right here. This is a history that is lies at the basis of kind of all of the material that we consider to be Canadian heritage as well. So when it's in a collection like the Royal Ontario Museum, it's considered to be kind of the property of a public constituted by Indigenous people, perhaps, but kind of constituted by their bodies in a lot of ways, right? So that's there. I'm going to move on from that and develop the idea of the specimen, because there's a second phase of anthropology that produced a different kind of object of collection into museums. Okay, so after that period, you have the cultural anthropologists. You have Franz Boas, who reoriented American anthropology with a focus on cultural specificity over evolutionary classifications, and he emphasized fieldwork and cultural context. This is largely the same paradigm that we're working on today in anthropology, although anthropologists might disagree with me. But anthropology museums, anyway, this is the kind of the dominant way that Indigenous material culture is organized according to cultures. So rather than placing all of these materials into one line, running from the simple to the complex, just based on how they kind of look, because that's basically what it was, like phrenology of objects. Instead, I don't know, you can kind of see behind here, behind this case, you have, it's not actually a pointer. Sorry. Behind this case, which contains what's called a life group, where the object is considered to be kind of represented in its larger self, so in its context of use. Behind there, you can see all of these different cabinets, and each one of those cabinets represents one culture. And so all of the materials from a particular culture were placed in one of those cabinets, all right? So this is a radically different arrangement of materials and a radically different way of approaching the collection of material culture as well. So Franz Boas's thing was go into the community, find a translator basically, and kind of collect things that are related to each other, okay? So he didn't want someone to think to be like the authority on war clubs and go and get a single war club from every culture. He thought that every expert should be the expert in one area and collect materials that were relevant to that area, and then they should interpret all those materials based on the relationship and the language and the culture of that specific people. And I mean, that's kind of what we're working from today, right? The idea of cultures. Again, this is a kind of there's complexities that come about in terms of how we deal with cultural change, how we deal with the movements of people. But by and large, the idea of the culture is still kind of the dominant one today. One of the ways that this kind of anthropology, though, became problematic, I'm going to use the example of the wampum belt to kind of illustrate. Because one of the things that came out of cultural anthropology was the idea of salvage ethnography. And this was a period of time when Franz Boas was kind of reforming anthropology, and the colonial states of Canada and the United States were kind of booming, right? And they were trying to figure out their identities, and they were defining their borders through policy and through cultural means. And a whole host of, basically all of our material culture at that period of time was lifted from our communities and sent into museums, and it became heritage, right? So from the communities, it went to the museums in like a mass. This was at the beginning of the 20th century because of salvage ethnography. Salvage ethnography assumes the cultures it studies to be dying and its material remains in need of rescuing. And so they saw the kind of the dramatic kind of impact that colonialism was having on these communities and said, oh my God, these cultures are dying. We have to save them. Who? No, not the people. We have to save their stuff. So they got our stuff. And in one sense, I guess that's good they did, because now we, yeah, I guess you kept hold on to our stuff, but now we need it to kind of work with us again. I think an interesting example of how objects becoming material culture or becoming museum objects directly kind of interferes or crosses into the political realm is the example of Haudenosaunee wampum belts. So I'm working from an article by Margaret Bruchac that she released recently about strategic alienation. And she tells two different stories from two different points in time. One in 1892, when a Haudenosaunee chief sold 4 wampum belts to a collector. The Haudenosaunee at that time were still kind of working, or still, I mean, they still have their traditional governance systems intact, but they hadn't been, the government hadn't tried to replace them with the elected system yet. So the chiefs were still kind of in power. There was still a Haudenosaunee council. And one of the chiefs sold the belts to a collector because he knew he could get a lot of money for them. People were really interested in indigenous material culture, right? They were really wanted, there was like this kind of very acquisitive drive to get these materials. The other chiefs immediately deposed him. His clan mother said, no, get out of here. And they deposed him and they sued for the belt's return right away. But the judge ruled against the return, right? Again, these are items. Wampum belts are not items that individuals can buy and sell. They are not owned by the person who holds them. The person who holds them is a keeper, or it's their role to remember what the promises that were said that went with those wampum belts, all right? So they don't own them. They're just the caretakers. So when he sold them, that was not by Haudenosaunee laws like illegal. But the judge ruled against them and said that the wampums that had lost their original significance had become relics and curiosities. These are interesting terms to use because they imply that they are no longer in use, and that somehow they're being in the museum, by being in the museum, that they had been successfully severed from those indigenous people, and that the fact that they were let go at all means that they no longer had claim to them, which is an interesting and actually historically has been a very effective way to separate indigenous people from their materials and actually intervene in their political systems, okay? So in this way, the presence of indigenous objects in museums becomes evidence of the decline of their own cultures, and justifying their removal, again, because of salvage ethnography means you have to save the materials, even as the decline is enforced through colonial policy, right? So at the same period of time, you have the United States kind of consolidating its borders, it's drawing up its citizenship rules, which included things like unilaterally imposing American citizenship on or a form of American citizenship on Native peoples. Same thing happened in Canada around the same time, all right? Are unilaterally imposing Canadian sovereignty over Indigenous peoples. Okay. In the same article, Marge Bruchac goes back and like 100 years later, in like 2009, similarly, some wampum belts came up for sale at Sotheby's, and the same arguments were being made. And she finds that this illustrates the continuity of this specific kind of strategy in which something becomes a relic, right? An object becomes a relic before, and that kind of precedes its entry into the market, or kind of justifies its presence in the market. It's a relic. It's because of its significance, its cultural significance. It's also, it belongs in a museum is the logic, right? It becomes universal heritage rather than Haudenosaunee political tools. So that one is an interesting one. And this one, there's a longer story to this one, which I won't go into right now, but they did have to, I will say that Sotheby's does know better, but they found this one special hack that they don't want us to know about. No. So from the curiosity in the specimen, we come to the art object, okay? The art object is a different kind of mode of collecting and display, although I do think it has many similarities and kind of entanglements with both the curiosity and the specimen, okay? So modernist, especially the modernist form of art display, treats the object as a singular, standalone aesthetic expression, right? For this kind of display, you want an object that is as compact as possible. Even more than the ethnographic object, you need all of its kind of extra things cut away so that it is either a sculpture or a painting or something that resembles a modernist form of art, okay? And also it's something that you're assumed to be able to access on a one-to-one basis without any context. You're supposed to be able to look at this object and get some sort of sense of the human experience or some sort of direct connection with what the artist is intending through this object. So less context is better, more monumentality is better. This is the kind of display that we're most familiar with today, I think. When you walk into a museum, any type of museum, even the natural history museums now do the kind of masterpiece style of display, where you elevate an object, you emphasize its beauty, you emphasize its color and its singularity, okay? Yeah, we use this one. I use this one all the time, right? Again, I'm trying to show the different kinds of display and the kind of logic of collection, and then maybe show some of the critiques of how they go about it. But these are just the different kinds of display we use. This one is a really interesting one, an example of a display at the Metropolitan Museum that has been made quite recently. And this one, I think, crucially connects historical beautiful artworks with contemporary Indigenous artwork, all right? So that we can see how contemporary Indigenous artists are connected to and are still carrying on those traditions in a way that can change and flow, right? And that we're both contemporary peoples and deeply rooted in our histories. So I like this display because it shows a continuity of culture, and it shows how beautiful some of these items are. Just key parts of the modernist art style of art display, you frame the object as artwork, and you isolate it, elevate it, and monumentalize it, okay? So this is how you make art objects out of kind of material culture. So this is an example from the show, the kind of groundbreaking show, Indian Art of the United States in 1941 at the Museum of Modern Art, okay? And this was an interesting example. I guess I don't have time to go into it right now, but you have this style of what was called affinity between what was then considered to be primitive arts and modernist American arts. It is a kind of to me, it recalls the same kind of logic as this kind of evolutionary kind of schema from savage to civilized, where they're trying to kind of use indigenous cultures to kind of provide an other to their own. So the idea of primitive art has been well critiqued, but I do find it has its remnants in shows that kind of, without context, put indigenous materials into conversation with especially modernist American materials, just based on kind of how they look. So I, for one, do like a bit of context. I also want to point out how, indigenous belongings have circulated in Western art contexts as primitive art and as the aesthetic alternatives to the European academic tradition. So it is important to note that that in their circulation globally, indigenous materials, whether they've been parted with by legitimate means or not, they have had a huge impact on non-indigenous institutions and art forms. So for example, this is André Breton, largely considered the key figures of European modernism anyway. And he had a huge collection of indigenous materials, including pieces that by today's standards, we wouldn't buy or sell those anymore, like these Katzenam on the wall there. He has also had a lot of Northwest Coast masks, one of which was recently, no, I guess it was 10 years ago now, not recently, but fairly recently repatriated to its community from which it was confiscated on the Northwest Coast there, all right? So I don't find, it's often kind of considered to be common sense that putting an object in an art museum somehow elevates it out of the Natural History Museum or removes it from this problematic history of extraction. But I don't necessarily find that to be the case. I found that the objects in art museums often come from the same histories of kind of extraction and appropriation. So it's not necessarily the case that the style that it's installed in or the kind of museum it's in means it's kind of less problematic or less colonial, right? All those histories are always there, all right? So with that in mind, and I know I don't have much more time. How much time? We want another 10 minutes? Can I do another 10 minutes? All right, okay. Well, 10 minutes, I'll go over. So this is how we fix all of this. Next, I want to go really quickly through some important interventions I think that have been made into these histories or responses or ways that we've have been helpful in recent years that I think are important to highlight. So modes of reclamation. One very straightforward one is inclusion. One of the critiques of the ways that Indigenous materials have been displayed in the Western Museum is the kind of separation, even within the same time period, of Indigenous materials with settler materials, right? So Indigenous artists who were working in the 1920s, even if they weren't making paintings, some of them were, but Indigenous peoples almost get put in a different time period and often a different museum than contemporary art. So one strategy for bridging that divide is to put Indigenous materials into existing displays in different existing contexts where Canadian art or other kinds of Western art is displayed. So here at the National Gallery of Canada, there's one example of that. You'll also see this at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Art Gallery of Ontario, where you take material, culture, and sometimes modern or contemporary artworks by Indigenous artists, and you put it in conversation in a contextually supported way with the installations that are already there. It can be quite beautiful. In some cases, I think it's there's good critiques to be made about the appropriateness of putting things of taking things out of the context of their own cultural context and put into kind of an aesthetic relationship. But I think this is an important and interesting experiment, and I think it's interesting to watch how this has taken place in especially regional and national museums. So inclusion is one. Cultural centers is another very much overlooked one. Our cultural centers are very much underfunded today, and I think they are doing kind of heroic work. So like the Woodland Cultural Center, which was built on the site of the Brantford Residential School, right? Mohawk Institute. They have control of that site now, and they're trying to raise money to kind of make that into an interpretive site instead. But they're also a really important site where Indigenous artwork is collected and displayed in a kind of community context. So cultural centers, they were especially there was a lot of them that rose in the 70s and 80s alongside what was then kind of the American Indian movement or the Red Power movement, alongside this kind of civil rights context in the 60s, and especially after we gained the ability to like vote and go to school in the 60s. The 70s and 80s were just was just an explosion in these cultural centers and as very political sites of cultural organizing. So these are important. Repatriation, I feel like this has almost become a very kind of commonplace term now. We know what repatriation is. It's when objects are returned from museums to Indigenous communities, an immensely important part of the reclamation of these cultures, because a lot of these materials were taken in ways that by any legal standards were not so on the up and up. So there was, in the States, they actually have this legislated, the NAGPRA repatriation of 1995, there's actually legislation that any federally funded institution in the United States, in order to keep receiving their federal funding, they had to make a catalog of all their Indigenous materials of a certain kind of human remains, funerary objects, and sacred items. Those categories have since kind of been critiqued and kind of proven very difficult to deal with sometimes, but they were supposed to make lists of those and send them to all the communities. So they were supposed to let everyone know. That process is definitely still ongoing. In Canada, we did not have it legislated, but the Canadian Museums Association had a kind of a policy-based similar thing, but it was policy. It was called the Task Force for First Peoples in Museums around the same time. Also something we were continued to deal with. All right. And then 2017, UNDRIP also asserted the right of Indigenous peoples to their material cultures and their remains. Rematriation, I think, is a really important kind of development of this process. And this is the key part of this. I'll quote Robin Gray here, In rematriation, you use the laws of the source nation. Let that be the framework for making decisions about what happens by being accountable to partnership and collaboration. So I think this is an important way. The idea of rematriation, she's trying to get away from the idea of repatriation, the idea of patrimony, and the idea of kind of cultural heritage that is kind of the dominant form right now, especially since UNESCO has kind of determined what is and isn't kind of culture. But she tries to use the term rematriation to talk about a process that is of repatriation, but kind of trying to complement it and fill it out. So paying attention and judging these things by the standards of the community and not by the standards of the settler state is a key kind of development in this. Collaboration and collections access. This is yours truly with my collaborator Renee Dillard and Ruth Phillips doing collections visits to some really important materials in museums. The work that's being done within museums to kind of make access happen between communities and their ancestral materials, I think is a really important place where this work of reclamation can be done, because it, as I mentioned at the beginning, it is actually the artists and the people who are engaged in the material processes of knowledge that are actually going to make these reclamations meaningful for us and actually make them relevant to our lives again. So reclaiming maker knowledge and being in contact with those objects in a way that allows them to be teachers for us is a hugely important part of reclamation. And finally, revitalization, which I think is, I'm going to frame here as something that is done by artists. So when I say collections access and object kind of relationships in museums, that's often the case oftentimes done by scholars or by people like myself who are trained in museum methods, right? That's not every community member. So I find that the key point where this kind of reclamation of culture is happening is artists and who are in communities or in their own contexts who are making things. They're engaging not only with materials like this black ash, which is an essential, has been an essential partner in our survival for so long, and they're becoming a way that our connection to those plant-based nations and those environmental realities, that becomes possible again through the embodied work that those makers do. So some of the key ladies that I want to send a shout out to here: Irene McAdebin, who is a powerhouse from Sagamok First Nation. She's a black ash basket maker and also someone who is fully fluent in the language. And so her accounts of how she works with black ash in Anishinaabemowin are an unparalleled treasure. Renee Wasson Dillard, who's an Odawa woman from Little Traverse Bay. And she's someone who was a black ash basket maker for a long time, but since the kind of the ecological issues that we're having with black ash now, she's been looking to other forms of weaving and has been instrumental in. She is actually the key figure in revitalizing bulrush mats, which was our architecture during when we were kind of seasonally mobile. So bulrush mats covering lodges, that's what she's working on. And so I find her inspirational. And a shout out as well to Carrie Hill, who's an Akwesasne basket maker who is doing just incredible things with black ash. So here she's got the mask on. She's got the COVID mask on. She's saying it's gonna. Well, she's got her other mask on under there, but she says this covering, I'm making it relevant to the times. Finally, I want to bring it back to the Ursula Johnson work that I started with, because to me, this her working on that black ash, and she's allowing the materials to teach her, and she's illustrating what it is that is the larger self of the object and how these kind of museum-based relationships, because she started this project in contact with those baskets made by her grandmother and those other Mi'kmaq women. And she went from there to the tools, to the tree, and then she learned. And through that process, she's been able to reconstitute an entire practice that revolves around black ash basketry. I love this one, especially this one's called Basket Weaving Cultural Cocoon. And she has this whole practice where she envelops herself and other people in this cocoon, in this kind of very, very personal and intimate kind of web of basketry. So here she is just weaving herself right back into that basket, which I think is beautiful, because these things, as as much as they are kind of important to think about objects in museum cultures returning to communities, the larger object is the knowledge around it and the kind of the ways that that intergenerational knowledge and the ways that that it extends out from itself to replicate itself through us, right? That's the larger object that we're trying to repatriate, and the idea that it can also encompass us, right? And it can reach out from the museum to encompass us, its descendants, is, I think, a beautiful possibility. But with that, I'm going to end my talk for today, and Miigwech for your attention.
All right, so thank you so much, Professor Migwans. What an honor to hear all the great things that you are working on, and I certainly was enlightened about different things. I'm more of a traditionalist in Western culture and museums, and so bringing this into the context has really brought in a new light. So thank you for that. So hopefully we'll have a lot more engaging questions when we go over there as well. So I'll have one-on-one. On behalf of Woodsworth College and our Alumni Association, I'd like to express our utmost gratitude for you for doing this for us and to sharing these insights. Thank you to Carolyn Peralta and the staff at Woodsworth College as well for all the help in organizing this event. And also a thanks to Melody Liu of the University College Museum and the staff and technical team there for their support in managing and making this a seamless time together. So thank you for that. And thank you for coming here today as well. Appreciation. One of the things that we will have is that if this is the first time that you've been here, please check out the Woodsworth College website for information on future events. We're having one on March 26th, which is the U of T Giving Day. This is the year. Our featured Giving Day fund is the Woodsworth College Expansion and Renovation Fund. Gifts to this fund will be matched twice, not once, but twice. So your gift will be impacting 3 times. So the new academic building project is underway, and when completed, there will be many inviting spaces for us to get together and socialize in our community, and also bringing students closer to the alumni. So between February 26th, which is coming up, and March 26th, every dollar donated to Wordsworth's feature fund up to $1,000 will be matched by both U of T and Woodsworth. So before we say goodbye, I'd like to mention that we will be sending a short survey. We love surveys. And it would be much appreciated if you could take a minute or two to complete it. And we would love to hear from you in terms of the things that you liked about what you saw tonight, and certain things about in the future that you would like to look at as well. So thank you, everyone, for coming and for joining us here today. And thank you once again.